Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. It was the third door on the right, always slightly ajar, casting a thin line of shadow onto the polished floorboards. Each day, as if following an unwritten routine, I would catch a glimpse of the narrow sliver, unchanging and steady on my way down the corridor. The door never closed, and it never opened further. Until last week, when I noticed the door to the left had started to mimic this pattern, just a crack open, identical in its precise slant. This morning, only the left door was ajar. I walked past again just now, and they both stand ajar, perfectly parallel, yet somehow misaligned. The sound came first, a soft scratching like fingernails against fabric. I thought it was the radiator settling, the building breathing through its old bones, but radiators don't scratch in patterns of 3. I keep returning to that afternoon when she asked about my routine. Such an innocent question, delivered with that slight tilt of her head, watching me over her coffee cup. The steam rose between us like a question mark. How did she know I had a routine at all? The hallway stretches longer than it should, 17 steps from my door to the elevator, but sometimes I count 19, sometimes 15. The carpet has a pattern that shifts depending on the light filtering through the window at the far end. Geometric shapes that form faces when you're not looking directly at them. She mentioned the doors once, said she'd noticed them too, but when I asked her which apartment was hers, she gestured vaguely toward the end of the hall. I've walked that corridor dozens of times since then. There are only 4 doors past mine. The scratching stopped the day I found the note, folded paper, cream-colored, tucked under my door like a secret. The handwriting was familiar in a way that made my chest tight. 3 words, you see too. I started keeping a journal after that, not of events but of observations, the way shadows fall differently on certain days, how the elevator sometimes arrives before I press the button. The frequency of footsteps in the apartment above mine, which according to the building directory should be empty. She was there again this morning, standing near the window at the end of the hall, not looking out but at the reflection in the glass. When I approached, she turned and smiled, but her reflection kept staring at something behind me. I didn't turn around to look. The pattern is becoming clearer now, though I'm not sure I want to see it completely. The doors, the sounds, the way certain conversations loop back on themselves like broken records. She always asks the same questions, just phrased differently each time. I found her key in my coat pocket. Not a copy, the original, worn smooth at the edges, with a small chip in the brass that I remember from when she first showed it to me. But I've never been in her apartment. I don't even know which one it is. The building manager looked at me strangely when I asked about the tenant records, said the system had been acting up, files corrupting themselves, but his eyes held something else. Recognition, maybe, or warning. I've been standing in front of these doors for 20 minutes now, both ajar, both waiting. The key fits either lock, I've checked, but opening one might close the other forever, and I'm beginning to understand that some doors aren't meant to be opened. They're meant to be watched. The scratching has started again, coming from behind both doors now, synchronized like a heartbeat, or like someone on the other side, matching my rhythm exactly, waiting for me to make a choice I'm not sure I'm ready to make. The corridor feels different tonight, longer, darker. The geometric patterns in the carpet have shifted into something that looks almost like a map, if maps could show you places that exist only in the space between decisions. She's standing behind me now. I can feel her presence without turning around, can hear her breathing in time with mine. When I finally look back, she's holding another note. This one has my handwriting on it, though I don't remember writing it. "You see too," it says, but underneath, in letters I definitely didn't write, "You always have." The doors are moving now, opening and closing by degrees, like the building itself is breathing. And I realize I've been holding my breath for much longer than should be possible, waiting for something that might already be happening. Story 2. Handle didn't resist my grip. As I stepped inside, the floorboards failed to echo my passage, absorbing each step in a mute hush. I flicked the light switch, but the bulb merely swayed without casting a glow. My fingers brushed the wall, expecting the usual texture, but the surface felt unfamiliar, smooth where it should have been grainy. In the stale air, the absence hovered densely, wrapping around like a thick cloud. I reached the window, uncertain if it was open or sealed, and my touch yielded no answer. The silence was wrong. I knew this because I had listened to it before in another house under different circumstances. But was it different? Memory has a way of reshaping itself, like water finding new channels in sand. I stood there in the darkness, understanding that I had been searching for this particular quality of emptiness for longer than I cared to admit. The investigation began months earlier, though I struggled to pinpoint exactly when suspicion first took root. Perhaps it was the way she folded the newspaper each morning, creasing it with unusual precision, or how her coffee cup always sat at the same angle on the kitchen counter, the handle pointing toward the door as if prepared for a quick departure. These details accumulate like sediment, building layers of unease that eventually demand attention. I had been a claims investigator for the insurance company for years, accustomed to the subtle inconsistencies that reveal fraud. People lie with their bodies before their words betray them. They arrange objects in patterns that speak of preparation, of minds already 3 steps ahead of consequence. But this case felt different from the beginning, though I couldn't articulate why. The fire had consumed the house on a Tuesday. The report came across my desk with routine indifference: electrical malfunction, total loss, substantial payout required. The photographs showed the familiar aftermath of domestic destruction, charred timber and melted fixtures creating abstract sculptures of loss. Yet something in the angles of debris suggested intention rather than accident. She had been staying at her sister's house that week, a convenient absence that raised no immediate flags. Family visits happen, people leave town, houses burn while their owners sleep safely elsewhere. The timing only becomes suspicious in retrospect, when other details align to form patterns that may or may not be meaningful. I remember the first interview conducted in a coffee shop downtown. She chose a table near the window, her back to the wall, eyes scanning the street with casual vigilance. Her hands remained still throughout our conversation, folded precisely in her lap, emerging only to sign documents or gesture toward specific questions. The stillness struck me as practiced, like someone accustomed to controlling involuntary movements. She answered each question with appropriate emotion, her voice catching at expected moments, tears appearing on schedule. The performance was flawless, which was precisely what troubled me. Genuine grief rarely follows such neat choreography. It stumbles and repeats itself, circles back to irrelevant details, loses track of chronology. Her narrative proceeded with linear clarity from beginning to end, each fact supporting the next in logical progression. But doubt is a patient predator. It waits in peripheral vision, gathering strength while you focus on obvious details. I found myself returning to the case file repeatedly, studying the photographs with increasing intensity. The burn patterns told a story that contradicted the official report, suggesting multiple points of origin rather than a single electrical failure. Yet experts had examined the evidence and found nothing conclusive. The sister's house became my next destination, though I told myself it was routine follow-up. The address led me to a quiet neighborhood where houses sat behind mature trees, their windows watching the street with dignified reserve. I parked across from the property and observed the daily rhythms of domestic life, noting who came and went, how long lights remained on, which rooms showed activity at different hours. She emerged each morning at the same time, walking to the mailbox with measured steps, her head turning left and right in a pattern that seemed more surveillance than casual observation. The routine never varied, suggesting either habit or hypervigilance. I began to wonder if she was watching for something specific or someone. The breakthrough came through accident rather than investigation. I had been sitting in my car outside the sister's house when a moving truck arrived. Workers began loading furniture and boxes with efficient haste, supervised by a woman whose profile looked familiar from a distance. As she turned toward the street, I recognized the careful posture and controlled movements from our coffee shop interview. She was leaving town, taking nothing but essentials and a few carefully selected items. The timing suggested urgency rather than planned relocation. People who have nothing to hide don't typically abandon established lives with such abrupt finality. I followed the truck from a distance, noting its destination without making contact. The new address belonged to a rental property in a town 3 hours away, the kind of anonymous suburb where people go to disappear. I drove past twice, memorizing details, before returning home to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the case. The move changed the context of every previous interaction, casting routine answers in a different light. I began to research her background more thoroughly, discovering gaps in employment history and inconsistencies in residential records. The pattern suggested someone accustomed to periodic reinvention, to shedding identities like seasonal clothing. The burned house represented just another transition in a life built around strategic departures. Yet proof remained elusive. Suspicion without evidence creates its own form of torment, a constant questioning of perception and judgment. I found myself reviewing the case obsessively, searching for the detail that would transform speculation into certainty. The photographs became talismans, examined so frequently that I memorized every shadow and angle. The insurance company closed the case and issued payment, satisfied with the official findings. My supervisors moved on to other investigations, leaving me alone with my doubts and theories. But obsession doesn't respect bureaucratic conclusions. It demands resolution regardless of institutional convenience. I decided to visit the rental house, telling myself it was closure rather than stalking. The drive took me through familiar countryside, past landmarks that triggered memories of previous surveillance trips. The landscape had become associated with this case in my mind, each mile marker counting down towards some undefined confrontation. The house sat empty when I arrived, windows dark and lawn showing signs of neglect. A realtor's sign indicated recent vacancy, suggesting another hasty departure. I walked the perimeter, noting details that might prove relevant, though relevant to what remained unclear. The investigation had become self-perpetuating, generating its own momentum independent of rational purpose. The back door stood slightly ajar, an invitation or oversight that demanded exploration. I told myself I was protecting the property, preventing vandalism or theft. The rationalization felt thin even as I constructed it. but obsession requires constant justification to maintain its forward motion. Inside, the house retained traces of recent occupation, indentations in carpet where furniture had stood, rectangles of unfaded paint where pictures had hung, the lingering scent of someone else's life. I moved through empty rooms, searching for evidence of what I couldn't say. The absence felt deliberate, as if the space had been carefully scrubbed of identifying details. But erasure is never complete. In the bedroom closet, I found a single photograph wedged behind the baseboard, overlooked in the haste of departure. The image showed two women standing beside a car, their faces turned away from the camera towards some distant point of interest. The pose suggested candid documentation rather than formal portraiture, a moment captured without the subject's awareness. The car in the photograph was the same model and color as the one destroyed in the fire, though from this angle I couldn't confirm the license plate. The detail felt significant, though its meaning remained opaque. I pocketed the photograph and continued my search, finding nothing else of obvious relevance. The kitchen revealed more subtle traces, a coffee ring on the counter in the exact position I had observed at the sister's house, the same precise angle that had first caught my attention. The consistency suggested compulsion rather than coincidence, a psychological signature that transcended location. Some patterns run deeper than conscious choice. I left the house with more questions than answers, the photograph burning in my pocket like stolen evidence. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, my mind cycling through possibilities and implications. The case had evolved beyond professional duty into personal mission, though I struggled to define what success might look like. Weeks passed before I developed the photograph, uncertain what enlargement might reveal. The faces remained turned away, but the background showed architectural details that might prove traceable. I began visiting locations that matched the visible elements, comparing angles and perspectives with obsessive precision. The search led me through a dozen small towns, each stop adding fragments to an incomplete picture. The photograph had been taken outside a courthouse, I eventually determined, though which courthouse and on what occasion remained mysteries. The women's posture suggested tension rather than celebration, their bodies angled away from each other despite physical proximity. I began to suspect the photograph documented some legal proceeding, perhaps related to a previous insurance claim or property dispute. The possibility opened new avenues of investigation, though accessing court records required resources beyond my authority. The case was officially closed, my involvement no longer sanctioned or supported. But obsession doesn't respect institutional boundaries. I used vacation time to continue the search, following leads that grew increasingly tenuous with each iteration. The photograph became a talisman, examined so frequently that I memorized every shadow and detail. The women's faces remained hidden, but their body language spoke of secrets and shared complicity. The breakthrough came through chance rather than methodology. I was reviewing property records in a county courthouse when I recognized the architectural details from the photograph's background. The building's distinctive stonework and window placement matched perfectly, confirming at least the location of the image's origin. The clerk helped me access records from the relevant time period, searching for cases involving insurance fraud or property disputes. The files revealed a pattern of similar claims, each involving houses destroyed under suspicious circumstances, each claim eventually paid despite lingering doubts. The amounts were substantial but not excessive, calculated to avoid triggering intensive investigation. I found her name in multiple files, sometimes as claimant, sometimes as witness, occasionally as beneficiary. The pattern suggested systematic fraud conducted over years, a carefully orchestrated series of losses that generated steady income without attracting sustained attention. The burned house represented just the latest iteration of a proven strategy. Yet evidence remained circumstantial, patterns that suggested guilt without proving it conclusively. The legal system requires more than suspicion, more than coincidence. I had discovered a methodology but couldn't demonstrate intent beyond reasonable doubt. The investigation had revealed the shape of the crime without capturing its substance. I returned to the sisters' house, hoping to find additional evidence or witnesses who might provide testimony. The neighborhood had changed subtly since my last visit, several houses showing signs of new occupancy, the rhythms of daily life shifting in response to different residents and routines. The sister answered my knock with wary recognition, her expression suggesting she had been expecting this conversation. We sat in her living room, surrounded by furniture that looked familiar from my surveillance photographs, and discussed her sister's activities with careful circumspection. She revealed nothing directly incriminating, but confirmed my suspicions about the pattern of relocations and property losses. The conversation ended without resolution, both of us understanding that accusations without proof serve no purpose beyond mutual discomfort. I left with the certainty that my suspicions were correct, but my evidence insufficient. The case would remain officially closed, while the truth lived on in parallel, acknowledged but unprosecuted. I drove home through familiar countryside, past landmarks that had become associated with this investigation in my memory. The landscape held traces of all my previous trips, each journey adding layers of significance to ordinary features. The case had colonized my perception, transforming neutral territory into a geography of obsession. The photograph remained in my files, a reminder of questions that would never receive satisfactory answers. I had pursued the investigation to its logical conclusion and found only the confirmation of uncertainty. Truth and proof occupied different territories, sometimes overlapping but never completely coinciding. Months later, I heard about another house fire in a distant county, another suspicious loss that would generate insurance claims and investigative reports. The pattern continued beyond my involvement, suggesting that some crimes are too carefully constructed to be stopped by individual effort. The system has gaps, and certain people understand how to navigate them. I never saw her again, though I occasionally wondered about her current location and activities. The investigation had connected us in ways that transcended professional duty, creating a shared awareness of secrets and suspicions that would persist regardless of physical distance. Some relationships are defined by what remains unspoken rather than what gets revealed. The case taught me about the limitations of certainty, the spaces between knowledge and proof where doubt takes residence. I had followed the evidence as far as it could lead and found myself standing at the edge of an abyss that demanded faith rather than facts. The investigation had become a mirror, reflecting my own assumptions and biases back with uncomfortable clarity. I returned to routine casework, processing claims with the same methodical attention to detail, but the experience had changed my relationship with evidence and truth. Every case now carried the possibility of hidden depths, patterns that extended beyond immediate observation. Suspicion had become a permanent resident in my professional consciousness. The burned house was eventually demolished, its lot sold to developers who built a new structure on the foundation. The physical evidence disappeared beneath fresh construction, but the questions persisted in my memory like ghosts haunting a rebuilt landscape. Some investigations conclude without resolution, their mysteries preserved in amber of perpetual uncertainty. I still drive past the location occasionally, noting how the new house sits on the same ground where the old one burned. The architecture is different, the residence unknown to me, but the coordinates remain constant. Geography outlasts the structures built upon it, just as questions outlast the investigations that generate them. The handle didn't resist my grip as I entered that empty rental house, searching for answers that would always remain just beyond reach. The silence held secrets that I was never meant to discover, truths that existed in the spaces between evidence and proof. I stood in that darkness, understanding finally that some mysteries are designed to remain unsolved, their power residing in perpetual ambiguity rather than definitive resolution. Story 3. The window was slightly ajar, curtains rippling in a rhythm they shouldn't have. The room was hushed, yet charged, as if holding its breath alongside me. I watched the streetlight cast barred shadows across the walls, inching with the night. It wasn't the glow that unsettled me, nor the silence that wrapped my stillness. It was the faint silhouette merging with the edges, whispering of a presence just outside my sight. I waited for something to ripple through the pattern again, but the shadows only thickened. A shiver crept along the spine of the air as the blinds tapped gently, a touchless, deliberate sign. My fingers traced the edge of the photograph now, worn smooth by months of handling. The paper curls at one corner where I've bent it back, trying to see what lies beyond the frame, but photographs never reveal more than they choose to. The woman in the image stares past the camera, past me, toward something I can never quite identify. Her mouth is slightly open, caught mid-sentence or mid-breath. I wonder what she was saying. I wonder if she knew. The detective's voice echoes differently in memory than it did in that sterile room. Flat, professional, detached in the way that comes from seeing too much. When did you last speak with her? But which conversation was the last? The one where she complained about the neighbor's dog, or the one where she mentioned feeling watched? Memory reshuffles these moments like cards in a deck, never landing in the same order twice. I told him about the dog. I think I told him about the dog. The coffee shop where we met that afternoon, or was it morning, had a broken air conditioner that rattled against the window. She kept glancing toward the sound, her fingers drumming against the ceramic mug. White mug, no blue. The details slip and reform, unreliable as water. I've been having the strangest feeling, she said, or I think she said. The words might have been mine, projected backward onto her lips. Memory is a generous liar. The rattling continues in my kitchen now, though there's no air conditioner here. Just the refrigerator cycling on and off, a mechanical heartbeat that measures the space between then and now. I open it sometimes just to stop the sound, but it always returns. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. I remember the stairs because I counted them 27 steps up, worn carpet that caught at the heel. The landlord had painted the hallway a shade of green that reminded me of hospitals, institutional green, the color of places where people wait. The door was unlocked when they found her. This detail appears in my notes, written in handwriting I don't quite recognize as my own. The ink is blue, then black, then blue again. Different pens for different days of obsession. No signs of forced entry, the report states. But what about signs of invited entry? What about doors opened willingly to familiar faces? The questions multiply in the margins of official documents, growing like ivy around the stark facts. I walk past her building sometimes, not intentionally. My feet simply carry me there while my mind wanders elsewhere. The green hallway has been repainted beige now, a color that tries too hard to be neutral. The new tenant has different curtains, red ones that hang straight and still, never rippling in rhythms they shouldn't. The photograph shows her hands folded in her lap, wedding ring on the wrong finger, or perhaps my memory has flipped the image like a negative. She'd been divorced for 3 years, she told me, or 5 years. The number changes depending on which conversation I'm remembering, which version of truth I'm constructing from fragments. She was a quiet tenant, the landlord said, keys jingling as he spoke. Never any complaints, paid her rent early every month. But quiet can mean so many things. Quiet like peace, or quiet like fear. Quiet like contentment, or quiet like someone learning to make themselves invisible. The landlord's keys made music of a sort, random notes that meant nothing and everything. The detective asked about her routine. I told him she shopped for groceries on Wednesdays, always at the same store, always buying enough for exactly 1 week. But was it Wednesdays? The day blurs now, becomes any day, becomes every day. She shopped when she needed food. She ate when she was hungry. The ordinary rhythms of a life that seemed ordinary until it stopped. My own routine has shifted since then. I find myself checking locks twice, 3 times. The sound of my own footsteps on stairs makes me pause and listen for echoes. There are always echoes in stairwells, but now they seem purposeful, measured, like someone matching my pace from a distance. The coffee mug sits on my counter, unwashed, not her mug that one disappeared into evidence bags and police reports. This is mine, but I can't bring myself to drink from it anymore. The ceramic feels wrong against my lips, too smooth, too warm. I've switched to paper cups, disposable things that don't hold memories in their curves. Her neighbor mentioned the dog again when I spoke to him, or he mentioned it for the first time. My notes contradict each other on this point. A small dog that barked at specific times, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, but dogs bark for reasons. They bark at sounds their owners can't hear, at movements in shadows, at the approach of familiar strangers. Did the barking stop? I asked. A few days before, he said, maybe a week. I figured she'd finally complain to someone. But who do you complain to about a dog that barks at danger? Who listens when the warning comes in a language we've forgotten how to understand? The window in my room rattles now, though there's no wind. The curtains hang motionless while the glass trembles in its frame. I've checked the locks, examined the hinges, called a repair service that found nothing wrong. Some disturbances exist beyond the reach of practical solutions. Her diary was never found. The police mentioned this in passing, a detail that seemed insignificant among the larger mysteries. But everyone keeps records of some kind, receipts, shopping lists, phone numbers scribbled on napkins. The absence of personal documents feels deliberate, curated. Someone cleaned house before the official discovery. I dream of that green hallway sometimes, though in the dreams it stretches longer than 27 steps. The carpet pulls at my feet like quicksand while I climb toward a door that recedes with each step. The institutional green deepens to the color of deep water, of forests at midnight, of things that grow in darkness. The photograph reveals new details each time I study it. A shadow in the background that might be furniture or might be something else. A reflection in the window glass that could be clouds or could be watching eyes. The camera captures only a moment, but moments contain multitudes when examined closely enough. She seemed nervous lately, her coworker said. Kept checking her phone, looking over her shoulder. I asked if everything was okay, but she just smiled and said she was fine. Fine, the word that means everything and nothing, the polite barrier between truth and inquiry. How many times do we say fine when we mean afraid? How many smiles hide the growing certainty that something is wrong? The detective closed the case after 6 months. Insufficient evidence, no clear motive, no viable suspects. The file joins thousands of others in storage rooms where unsolved mysteries gather dust and wait for connections that may never come. But some cases refuse to stay closed. They follow you home, take residence in your peripheral vision, whisper questions during the quiet hours. I've started leaving my own window open at night, just a crack. The curtains move in patterns I'm learning to read, gentle waves that might mean nothing, sharp snaps that could signal everything. The shadows dance differently now, forming shapes that almost make sense before dissolving into ordinary darkness. Her mailbox still bears her name on a fading label. The new tenant hasn't bothered to change it, or perhaps the landlord forgot to mention it. Mail accumulates behind the small metal door, catalogs, bills, advertisements addressed to someone who will never read them. I've thought about collecting it, sorting through the final communications meant for her eyes. But that would cross a line from concern into obsession, from investigation into violation. The coffee shop closed last month. A handwritten sign in the window thanked customers for their support over the years. The broken air conditioner is gone, leaving a rectangular patch of unfaded paint on the wall. Progress erases the landmarks of memory, making the past harder to navigate, harder to verify. I carry the photograph with me now, tucked into a pocket where my fingers can find it without looking. The paper grows thinner with handling, the image fainter. Soon it will be more texture than picture, more suggestion than proof, but perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps truth was always more about feeling than seeing. The neighbor's dog has stopped barking entirely. I learned this during my most recent walk past her building, though I couldn't say exactly when I made this discovery or how I know it to be true. The silence feels heavier than the sound ever did, loaded with implications I'm afraid to examine too closely. My own sleep has become fragmented, broken into pieces that don't quite fit together when morning comes. I wake with the taste of conversations I can't remember having, with the echo of footsteps that might have been dreams or might have been something else entirely. The boundary between sleeping and waking grows thinner each night, more permeable. The detective retired last spring. His replacement speaks in the same professional tones, maintains the same careful distance from involvement, but the new voice lacks the weight of accumulated knowledge, the subtle understanding that comes from years of seeing patterns in chaos. Some cases require continuity of attention, a sustained focus that survives personnel changes and bureaucratic shuffles. I've begun to notice how many windows in my neighborhood remain lit during the deep hours of night. Insomnia seems to be spreading, a contagion of sleeplessness that connects strangers through their shared inability to rest. We are a community of the wakeful, bound together by what we cannot name or solve or forget. Her photograph stares back at me now with familiar patience. The woman frozen in that moment seems to be waiting for something, a word, a recognition, a final piece of understanding that will release her from the amber of unresolved mystery. But I no longer believe in final pieces. Truth, I've learned, is more like a river than a puzzle, always flowing, always changing, always carrying new sediment from upstream sources. The window rattles again, and this time I don't check the locks or call for repairs. Some disturbances are meant to be felt rather than fixed, acknowledged rather than explained. I pull the photograph from my pocket one more time, studying the face that has become as familiar as my own reflection. She looks past me toward something I will never see, her mouth slightly open around words I will never hear. The curtains move in their mysterious rhythm, keeping time with secrets that dance just beyond the edge of understanding. I watch and wait and wonder if she is watching too, from whatever place the disappeared go when their stories remain unfinished. The shadows deepen, the night breathes, and somewhere in the space between knowing and unknowing, truth continues its patient work of revealing itself one fragment at a time. The photograph goes back into my pocket, warm from my touch, ready for the next moment when memory demands proof of what can never quite be proven. Outside, the city sleeps fitfully, dreaming dreams that will dissolve with dawn, leaving only the lingering sense that something important has been forgotten. Something vital has slipped away in the darkness between sleeping and waking, between then and now, between the questions we ask and the answers that forever dance just beyond our reach. Story 4. The doors at the end of the corridor were always closed by evening, a detail I had accepted without question. Each day, as the shadows grew long, I would walk past them, eyeing their stillness as a comforting marker of routine. But last Tuesday, the fifth door had a subtle gap, as if nudged from its slumber. Another day, I felt a draft whispering through the fissure where none should exist. Tonight, all the doors were shut tight, yet the air trembled with a foreign chill. I never noticed this before, but now I can't ignore it. The coffee grew cold between my fingers. I remember that detail because I kept warming it in the microwave, each time forgetting I'd already done so. The taste became bitter, metallic, like pennies on your tongue. She mentioned pennies once during one of our conversations about childhood fears. Strange how that memory surfaces now, uninvited. I found the first note wedged beneath the welcome mat. Folded paper, creased from being stepped on repeatedly. The handwriting looked familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. Block letters spelling out words that seemed both urgent and mundane. Check the basement storage, third shelf from the left. Nothing threatening, yet my hands trembled as I read. The basement smelled of dampness and forgotten things. Cardboard boxes labeled in my own handwriting, though I couldn't recall making those labels. Third shelf from the left held a plastic container I'd never seen before. Inside, photographs of the building's hallways taken at different times. The same corridor, the same doors, but captured in various states of openness and closure. Someone had been documenting the pattern I'd only just begun to notice. She worked the night shift at the front desk. I know because I'd see her through the lobby windows when I returned from my evening walks, always reading paperback novels, always wearing that navy cardigan. We'd exchange polite nods, brief smiles, nothing more substantial than weather comments and holiday greetings. Yet somehow she knew about my morning routine, my preferred walking path, the exact time I collected my mail. The photographs were dated on the back. Months of documentation, spanning seasons I barely remembered. The doors appeared to follow a sequence, opening and closing in patterns that suggested intention rather than chance. In some images, shadows lingered in the door frames, dark shapes that could have been people or simply tricks of light and perspective. My neighbor mentioned hearing footsteps in the hallway during the early morning hours. Slow, deliberate steps that paused at each door before continuing. She assumed it was maintenance staff or security making rounds. I nodded and agreed, though I'd heard those same footsteps and knew they came from somewhere else entirely. The second note appeared in my mailbox, mixed between utility bills and grocery store circulars. Same handwriting, different paper. The pattern isn't random. Count the days between changes. I spread the photographs across my kitchen table and began marking dates on a calendar. The intervals revealed themselves slowly, like a code breaking apart under scrutiny. Every seventh day the doors shifted. Not all of them, never all at once, but specific doors in a rotating sequence that suggested someone was maintaining a schedule. The fifth door, the one I'd first noticed, served as a kind of anchor point. It remained consistently closed except during transition periods when it would open just enough to signal the beginning of a new cycle. She stopped working the night shift without warning. The lobby remained empty after dark, lit only by automated security lighting. I asked the building manager about the change, trying to sound casual. He looked confused, claimed there had never been a night desk attendant. The position had been eliminated due to budget cuts, he said, though he couldn't remember exactly when. I started staying awake to watch the corridor. Positioning myself where I could observe without being seen, I documented the changes myself. The doors moved between midnight and dawn, always during the quiet hours when most residents slept, but they didn't move on their own. I caught glimpses of movement, careful hands adjusting positions, maintaining the pattern someone else had established. The third note arrived through a different method, slipped under my apartment door while I dozed at my observation post. "You're not the only one watching, be more careful." The handwriting had changed, become more hurried, less controlled. Someone knew about my surveillance and felt compelled to warn me. I recognized her cardigan in one of the photographs. Navy wool, distinctive button pattern, draped over a chair barely visible in the background of an image focused on the corridor. She had been there in that space behind the doors during the documentation period. But if she'd never worked nights, why had I seen her in the lobby? Why had she known details about my routine that only careful observation could have revealed? The building's maintenance records showed no scheduled work in the corridor areas. No authorized personnel had keys to those particular doors, according to the property management company. Yet the pattern continued, precise and unwavering, maintained by someone with access and knowledge of the building's rhythms. I found myself drawn to the basement storage area repeatedly, searching for additional containers, more photographs, further evidence of the documentation project. Instead, I discovered personal items that seemed familiar yet foreign. A navy cardigan folded neatly in a plastic bag. Paperback novels with margins filled in handwriting I almost recognized. A building access card with no name, just a magnetic strip worn smooth from use. The pattern began to break down after I started watching. Doors that should have remained closed stood slightly ajar. Others that typically opened during transition periods stayed sealed. The careful sequence someone had maintained was deteriorating under the pressure of observation, like a performance losing its rhythm when the audience becomes visible. She appeared in my dreams wearing that cardigan, standing in doorways that led to spaces I'd never seen. Not speaking, just watching me with the same polite attention she'd shown during our brief lobby encounters. In the dreams, I understood that she'd been trying to tell me something important, but I'd been too focused on surface pleasantries to listen. The fourth note contained an apology. "I never meant for you to get involved. The pattern was supposed to remain invisible." Different handwriting again, though something about the letter formation suggested the same person writing under different emotional states. Fear changes how we hold a pen, how we form words, how much pressure we apply to paper. I stopped finding notes after that. The doors returned to random behavior, opening and closing without apparent logic or timing. The careful documentation ceased, leaving me with photographs and questions that multiplied rather than resolved. The corridor felt different now, charged with the memory of purpose but empty of actual intention. The building manager mentioned that a former resident had left personal items in storage. Someone who'd lived here for years before moving away suddenly, without forwarding address or explanation. The items needed to be cleared out, he said, asking if I'd help sort through them since I seemed interested in building history. Among those items, I found my own handwriting on labels I didn't remember creating. photographs of myself walking through the corridor, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been standing in those doorways I'd thought were sealed. Documentation of my own patterns, my routines, my predictable movements through spaces I'd assumed were private. The navy cardigan fit perfectly when I tried it on. The paperback novels contained margin notes that responded to thoughts I'd had while reading the same passages. The access card opened doors I'd never known existed, revealing rooms that connected the corridor spaces in ways that transformed the building's geography. I understand now that the pattern was never about the doors themselves. It was about creating a rhythm that would draw attention, a mystery that would compel investigation. Someone had been waiting for me to notice, to become involved, to discover what lay behind the careful choreography of opening and closing. But I still don't know if I was the one being watched or if I was the one doing the watching. The photographs suggest both possibilities, and the handwriting changes in ways that make me question my own memory of writing those notes. The corridor remains quiet now, the doors following no pattern except the one I create through my continued observation. Tonight, as I walk past the closed doors, I notice my own reflection in their polished surfaces, and I wonder if someone else has begun to watch me the way I once watched them, documenting my movements, waiting for the right moment to leave the first note. Story 5. The Untouched Cup. The morning sun threaded through the kitchen curtains, casting a delicate glow over the tiled floor. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air, mingling with the distant aroma of freshly baked bread from the bakery nearby. Everything was in its usual place except the teacup on the counter, untouched and still pristine, its handle pointing toward the door, slightly ajar. The silence, heavy and expectant, threatened to fracture the calm, urging my senses to attention, as if something unseen held its breath just beyond my sight. I found myself staring at that cup for what felt like an eternity. The porcelain was bone white with tiny blue flowers painted along the rim her favorite pattern. She always prepared her morning tea with such precision, 2 sugar cubes dissolved completely before adding the milk. But this cup held nothing but emptiness, and that emptiness spoke louder than any scream could have. The investigation began 3 weeks after she vanished. The authorities had already combed through the house, photographed every corner, dusted for prints that led nowhere. They left behind a sterile emptiness that felt worse than the original silence. When they finally allowed me back inside, I moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting my own memories. I started in her bedroom, running my fingers along the dresser where her jewelry box sat undisturbed. The velvet-lined compartments held their treasures exactly as she had arranged them, except for one missing piece, a silver locket her grandmother had given her. She wore it every single day, claimed it brought her luck. The police noted its absence in their report, filed it under possible theft, but something about that explanation never sat right with me. The neighbors began approaching me during those first few weeks, their voices hushed and eyes darting as if sharing state secrets. The woman from the house across the street mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars parked outside during the previous month, a delivery truck that stayed too long, a sedan with tinted windows that appeared sporadically, always during the afternoon hours when most people were at work. I found myself walking the same streets she would have taken, trying to trace her final steps. The route to the grocery store, the path through the park where she jogged every other morning, the small cafe where she sometimes stopped for her favorite pastry. Each location felt like a piece of a puzzle with too many missing corners. The cafe owner, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and flour-stained apron, remembered her well. She had been a regular customer for over 2 years, always ordering the same blueberry scone and black coffee. He mentioned that during her last visit, she seemed distracted, kept checking her phone and glancing toward the window. She left without finishing her coffee, something she had never done before. I asked to see the security footage from that day, but the owner explained that their system only kept recordings for 2 weeks before automatically deleting them. Another dead end in a case that seemed designed to frustrate any attempt at resolution. The detective assigned to her case was a tired-looking woman with graying hair and the demeanor of someone who had seen too much. She spoke in measured tones, careful not to offer false hope while maintaining professional optimism. According to her notes, there were no signs of struggle in the house, no indication of forced entry, no evidence of foul play beyond the simple fact that a woman had vanished without explanation. But I knew her better than any police report could capture. She was methodical, predictable in the most comforting way. She made lists for everything, kept a detailed calendar, never left home without telling someone where she was going. The idea that she would simply disappear voluntarily seemed as impossible as the sun rising in the west. I began going through her personal belongings with forensic precision, searching for anything the police might have overlooked. Her phone records showed nothing unusual: calls to family members, texts about mundane daily activities, a few work-related conversations. Her computer browser history revealed online shopping, news articles, social media scrolling, normal life documented in digital breadcrumbs. Then I found the notebook tucked beneath her mattress, a small leather-bound journal I had never seen before. The pages contained what appeared to be observations about people in her daily routine. The barista who worked mornings at her favorite coffee shop, the man who walked his dog past her jogging route, the postal worker who delivered mail to her neighborhood. At first, these seemed like innocent character sketches, but as I read deeper, a pattern of unease began to emerge. She had noticed the same faces appearing in different locations at different times. The barista from the coffee shop spotted at the grocery store where she never shopped. The dog walker seen near her workplace on a weekend when he should have been in the residential area. Small coincidences that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested something more deliberate. The final entry in the journal was dated just 4 days before she disappeared. The handwriting looked rushed, almost frantic compared to her usually neat script. She wrote about feeling watched, about the sensation of eyes following her movements even when she appeared to be alone. She mentioned planning to change her routine, to take different routes and visit new places to see if the feeling would fade. I brought this journal to the detective, who examined it with professional interest but ultimately dismissed it as paranoia. People often feel watched in crowded urban environments, she explained. The human brain is designed to detect patterns even where none exist, especially when someone is feeling anxious or stressed about other life circumstances. But I could not shake the feeling that these observations represented something real and threatening. I decided to retrace her steps using the journal as a guide, visiting the locations she had mentioned and looking for the people she had described. The coffee shop barista was a young man with nervous energy and darting eyes. When I showed him her photograph, he recognized her immediately but seemed uncomfortable discussing her disappearance. He mentioned that she had asked him questions about his schedule, about whether he worked at other locations, about his life outside the coffee shop. The questions had made him uncomfortable, though he could not articulate exactly why. I found the dog walker in the park where she used to jog. He was an older gentleman with a friendly golden retriever and a warm smile that faltered when I mentioned her name. He admitted to noticing her during their encounters, said she was always polite but seemed increasingly skittish during their final meetings. He had assumed she was dealing with personal problems and had tried to give her space. Each conversation left me with more questions than answers. These people seemed genuine in their concern, but there was something beneath the surface of each interaction that felt rehearsed or incomplete, as if they were all reading from the same script, careful to say the right things while revealing nothing substantial. I started carrying a small recorder, documenting these conversations for later analysis. When I played them back in the quiet of my own home, subtle inconsistencies became more apparent. The barista mentioned seeing her on days when her calendar showed she was somewhere else entirely. The dog walker described conversations that did not match her personality or speech patterns. Small discrepancies that could have been simple memory errors, but which collectively suggested a more complex truth. The breakthrough came when I discovered she had been attending a support group for people dealing with stalking situations. The group met weekly in the basement of a community center, led by a counselor who specialized in personal safety and threat assessment. When I contacted the counselor, she was initially reluctant to discuss individual participants, but eventually agreed to meet with me privately. She confirmed that my missing friend had been attending meetings for approximately 2 months before her disappearance. She had reported feeling followed and watched, but had been unable to identify a specific threat or individual responsible. The counselor had encouraged her to document incidents, to trust her instincts, and to contact law enforcement if the situation escalated. According to the counselor, this type of harassment often involved multiple individuals working in coordination, creating a web of surveillance that was difficult to detect or prove. The perpetrators were usually careful to stay within legal boundaries, never making overt threats or engaging in obviously criminal behavior. They relied on psychological pressure and the gradual erosion of their target's sense of safety and normalcy. This information reframed everything I thought I knew about her disappearance. Rather than a random crime or voluntary departure, it suggested a calculated campaign of intimidation that had ultimately achieved its goal. But the identity of those responsible remained as elusive as ever. I began paying closer attention to my own surroundings, wondering if the same network that had targeted her might now be focused on me. The paranoia was subtle at first, just a heightened awareness of faces in crowds and cars that seemed to appear too frequently. But gradually, the feeling grew stronger and more specific. The postal worker who delivered to her neighborhood began appearing on my street, despite the fact that different workers typically handled different routes. The man with the golden retriever started walking past my building, even though the nearest park was several blocks away. Small incidents that could have been coincidental, but which felt increasingly deliberate. I installed security cameras around my apartment and began varying my daily routine in unpredictable ways. The cameras captured nothing obviously suspicious, but I noticed that certain individuals seemed to anticipate my schedule changes, appearing in locations where I had decided to go on apparent impulse. The detective assigned to the case grew increasingly frustrated with my theories about coordinated surveillance networks. She pointed out that I had no concrete evidence of criminal activity, no proof that any specific individual had committed any specific crime. The law enforcement system was designed to respond to clear violations of established statutes, not to address vague feelings of unease or suspicious coincidences. But I could not abandon the investigation, even as it began consuming every aspect of my daily existence. I created detailed charts mapping the appearances of suspicious individuals, analyzed patterns in their behavior, documented every anomaly no matter how minor it seemed. The process became an obsession that isolated me from friends and family who grew tired of listening to theories they considered increasingly far-fetched. The final revelation came when I discovered that she had been planning to leave town permanently. Hidden in her closet, I found a suitcase packed with essential belongings and a folder containing research about distant locations where someone could start a new life with minimal documentation. She had been planning an escape, not just a temporary departure. But the suitcase was still there, untouched and waiting. Whatever had happened to her occurred before she could execute her carefully planned disappearance. Someone or something had intervened at the crucial moment, preventing her from reaching safety. I brought this evidence to the detective, who acknowledged its significance but remained skeptical about my broader theories regarding organized harassment. The packed suitcase suggested premeditation, but it did not necessarily support the existence of a surveillance network or coordinated stalking campaign. As I sit here now, staring at that same teacup that started this entire journey, I realize that I may never know the complete truth about what happened to her. The investigation has revealed layers of complexity and ambiguity that resist simple explanations or satisfying conclusions. But I cannot escape the feeling that the answer is closer than I realize, hidden in plain sight among the details I have documented so obsessively. Perhaps the truth is not about what happened to her, but about what is happening to me. Perhaps the real question is not who took her away, but who is watching me search for answers that were never meant to be found. The morning light fades as clouds gather outside the window. The jasmine scent has long since dissipated, replaced by the sterile smell of fear and uncertainty. And that teacup remains exactly where I found it, a silent witness to mysteries that may be better left unsolved. Story 6. The gentle creak of the floorboards resonated in the dimly lit hallway as morning sunlight filtered through the narrow windows, casting soft patterns on the walls. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of pine from the distant woods. Everything appeared ordinary until a peculiar chill prickled the air, emanating from the study at the end of the hall. The door, usually closed, stood ajar, revealing a room frozen in an unnatural stillness. In the center, a solitary chair was overturned, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the plush carpet, as if anticipating a hidden truth yet to surface. The nausea hits me first, always the nausea. It crawls up from somewhere deep in my stomach, spreading like spilled ink through my chest. I can't shake the feeling that I've forgotten something important, something that matters more than breathing. My hands are clean now, scrubbed raw under scalding water, but they still feel dirty. They still remember. I keep returning to that chair, not physically, but mentally. The way it lay there, one leg pointing toward the window, the other toward the door, as if it couldn't decide which way to run. The fabric was torn on the left armrest, 3 parallel gashes that looked deliberate, purposeful. But when I try to remember how they got there, my mind slides away like water off glass. The detective had kind eyes. That's what I remember most clearly about our conversation. Kind eyes and calloused fingers that drummed against his notepad while I spoke. He asked me to walk him through everything again, from the beginning, but beginnings are tricky things. They depend entirely on where you choose to start the story. Did it begin when I found the door open, or was it earlier when I first noticed the coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter? Maybe it started the night before when I heard those sounds from upstairs. Footsteps that were too heavy, too deliberate. Footsteps that belonged to someone who was trying very hard not to be heard. The house remembers things differently than I do. The walls hold echoes that my mind refuses to process. Sometimes when I'm washing dishes or folding laundry, I catch fragments of conversations that might have happened. Voices raised in argument, then suddenly muffled. a door slamming, the peculiar silence that follows violence. But that's not right, is it? There was no violence. I would remember violence. Violence leaves marks, and there were no marks. Only that overturned chair and the smell of fear that lingered in the air like perfume. I've been having trouble sleeping. When I close my eyes, I see hands reaching for things they shouldn't touch. Papers scattered across the desk, some of them torn. A pen lying on the floor, its cap missing. These details feel significant, but their significance hovers just beyond my grasp, like trying to remember a dream after waking. The phone rang while I was in the study. I remember that clearly because the sound was so jarring in that frozen silence. But when I answered, no one spoke, just breathing on the other end, shallow and rapid, the kind of breathing that comes after running or after being frightened. I hung up quickly, my fingers trembling against the receiver. That's when I noticed the photograph. It had fallen from the desk, face down on the carpet. When I picked it up, the glass was cracked in a spider web pattern, distorting the faces behind it. But I could still make out the smiles, the arms wrapped around shoulders, the casual intimacy of people who trust each other completely. Trust is a fragile thing. It can shatter as easily as glass, leaving sharp fragments that cut you when you try to piece it back together. I learned that long before I found the chair overturned, before I smelled the fear in the air, before I scrubbed my hands raw trying to wash away memories that won't stay buried. The detective asked me about my relationship with the missing person. Missing, not dead. That distinction seemed important to him, though I couldn't understand why. Missing people can come back, dead people cannot, but sometimes the difference between missing and dead is just a matter of time and patience. I told him we were close. That was true in its way. Closeness doesn't always mean affection. Sometimes it means proximity, necessity, the grinding intimacy of two people trapped in the same small space with nowhere else to go. Sometimes closeness is just another word for suffocation. The coffee was still warm when I found it. That detail bothers me more than the overturned chair, more than the torn photograph, more than the silence that pressed against my eardrums like water. Coffee doesn't stay warm for long. It is maybe 20 minutes before it starts to cool, maybe 30 if the cup is thick and the room is warm. The kitchen was cold that morning. I remember because I had to wrap my arms around myself to stop shivering. So the coffee was recent, fresh, which means I had just missed something, someone. The thought makes my skin crawl, the idea that I was so close to understanding, so close to preventing whatever happened in that study. But preventing what exactly? Nothing happened in the study, nothing that left evidence anyway. The detective's partner had different eyes, cold eyes that seemed to look right through me as if I were made of glass. She asked harder questions, questions that made me stumble over my words and contradict myself. She wanted to know about the scratches on my arms, the ones I hadn't noticed until she pointed them out. Thin red lines that could have come from anything. Thorns from the garden, a cat that didn't want to be held. Fingernails digging in during a struggle that I can't quite remember. But there was no struggle. I would remember a struggle. Struggles are loud, messy things. They leave more than scratches. They leave bruises and torn clothing and furniture knocked over and chaos scattered across every surface. The study was pristine except for that one chair, that one photograph, that one pen lying capless on the floor. I keep thinking about the pen. It was expensive, the kind with real gold trim and a weight that spoke of quality. The kind of pen you use to sign important documents, contracts, wills, confessions. The ink was still wet on the tip when I found it, a small blue bead that hadn't quite dried. But there was nothing written anywhere, no papers with fresh ink, no signatures or final words or explanations. The missing person always used that pen, carried it everywhere like a talisman, clicking the mechanism when nervous or deep in thought. Click, click, click. The sound used to drive me to distraction, especially during those long conversations that weren't really conversations at all, but interrogations disguised as concern. Those conversations always ended the same way, with accusations I couldn't defend against because they were true, and with promises I couldn't keep because I was weak, with tears that felt like acid on my cheeks and apologies that tasted like ash in my mouth, with the sound of footsteps walking away, always walking away, leaving me alone with my shame and my guilt and my growing certainty that something had to change. But change is a dangerous thing. It requires action, and action requires courage, and courage is something I've never possessed in sufficient quantities. I've always been better at waiting, at hoping, at pretending that problems will solve themselves if ignored long enough. It's a coward's strategy, but it served me well enough until now. The detective asked if I had any idea where the missing person might have gone. Friends to visit, family in other towns, favorite places to think or hide or start over. I told him no, which was mostly true. There were no friends, not anymore. Family was a complicated subject, full of old wounds and burned bridges, and favorite places were a luxury we couldn't afford. But there was one place, a small clearing in the woods behind the house, where the pine trees grew so thick that sunlight could barely penetrate the canopy. It was quiet there, peaceful in a way that the house never was. We used to go there together sometimes, before things got complicated, before trust became a weapon we used against each other. I haven't been back to the clearing since I found the chair overturned. I tell myself it's because the woods are dangerous, full of hidden roots and sudden drops and wild animals that don't appreciate human intrusion. But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I'm afraid of what I might find there, or what might find me. The house feels different now, larger somehow, as if rooms have been added when I wasn't looking. The hallways stretch longer than they should, and the shadows fall at wrong angles. Sometimes I hear that coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen, brewing a fresh pot for someone who will never come to drink it. Sometimes I smell pine from the distant woods, carried on breezes that shouldn't exist indoors. The detective called yesterday to tell me they were expanding the search, bringing in dogs and volunteers and equipment that can find things buried deep underground. He sounded tired, frustrated by the lack of progress. Missing persons cases are difficult, he explained. People disappear for all sorts of reasons, and most of them have nothing to do with foul play. Most of them end with someone starting over somewhere else, leaving their old life behind like a snake shedding skin. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to imagine the missing person sitting in some distant coffee shop, reading a newspaper and planning a new future. Free from the weight of our shared history, free from the suffocating closeness that had poisoned everything we touched. It would be a kindness, really, a mercy for both of us. But the overturned chair keeps intruding on that fantasy. Chairs don't overturn themselves. They require force, intention, the application of will to the physical world, and that expensive pen with its wet ink and missing cap, lying on the floor like an abandoned signature. These details anchor the missing person to this place, to this house, to me. The detective's partner called this morning. She wanted to search the property again, more thoroughly this time. She asked if I had any objections, and I said no because objecting would make me look guilty of something. But guilty of what? Caring too much, caring too little, failing to prevent something I didn't understand was happening. She found the shovel in the garden shed. It was dirty, caked with soil and organic matter that could have been anything. Compost, fertilizer, the remains of last year's vegetable garden. She bagged it anyway, along with my gardening gloves and the old tarp I used to cover the lawn mower. Everything gets bagged in missing persons cases. Everything becomes potential evidence of crimes that may never have been committed. I should feel violated by this intrusion, this systematic dismantling of my private life. Instead, I feel relieved. Let them search. Let them bag and catalog and analyze every inch of my existence. Maybe they'll find answers to questions I'm afraid to ask. Maybe they'll solve the mystery of that overturned chair and that expensive pen and that photograph with its spider web of cracks. Or maybe they'll find nothing at all. Maybe the missing person really did walk away, leaving behind only the detritus of a life that had grown too small to contain their dreams. Maybe the chair fell over in the wind from an open window. Maybe the pen rolled off the desk during a minor earthquake. Maybe the photograph cracked from age and humidity and the simple passage of time. But I know better, deep in the place where truth lives, beneath the layers of self-deception and wishful thinking, I know that something terrible happened in that study. Something that required the overturning of chairs and the abandoning of expensive pens and the shattering of photographs that held too many memories. The woods are calling to me now. I can hear them whispering through the windows, promising answers to questions I don't want to ask. The pine trees sway in rhythms that match my heartbeat, and the shadows between them pulse with secrets that demand to be told. Maybe tomorrow I'll find the courage to walk that familiar path to the clearing where we used to sit together in silence. Maybe I'll discover what the missing person wanted me to know, what message they left in that overturned chair and that abandoned pen. Maybe I'll finally understand why my hands remember being dirty even though they're clean now, scrubbed raw under scalding water that never seems hot enough to wash away the truth. But tonight I'll stay inside, listening to the house remember things I choose to forget. Tonight I'll let the coffee maker gurgle and the shadows fall at wrong angles and the nausea crawl through my chest like spilled ink. Tonight I'll pretend that missing people always come back, that chairs overturn themselves, that expensive pens abandon themselves to gravity without human intervention. Tonight I'll pretend that the gentle creak of floorboards is just the house settling, not the sound of footsteps that were too heavy, too deliberate. Footsteps that belonged to someone who was trying very hard not to be heard, but failed in that effort just as they failed in so many others. The truth is patient, it can wait. Story 7. The box snapped shut with an unexpected thud. A fine layer of dust clung to my fingertips, gritty and ancient, as if the weight of years had settled into the grooves of my skin. The room was thick with the scent of cedar and secrets, an intimacy that crept under my flesh. My breath caught as the fabric brushed against my ankle, whispering its cold, unseen truth. I glanced around, sensing a dissonance in the air, a muted ripple in the room's solemnity. The silence wrapped tighter, yet the room felt too loud, as if it held a breath I hadn't noticed before. I was supposed to be cleaning out the storage room in the basement. That's what I tell myself now anyway. The landlord had given me permission to clear out whatever the previous tenant had left behind. Simple enough cardboard boxes, old furniture, the usual detritus of a life interrupted. The fabric that touched my ankle was just a curtain fallen from one of the boxes. Navy blue cotton, nothing remarkable, the kind you'd find in any discount store. The box I just closed contained photographs, family snapshots mostly. A woman with short dark hair appearing in most of them, always smiling that practiced smile people reserve for cameras. There were birthday parties, holiday gatherings, ordinary moments frozen in glossy squares. I'd been sorting them methodically, planning to contact the landlord about returning them to relatives, the responsible thing to do. But as I moved through the room, cataloging items, something felt rehearsed about my movements, like I'd done this before, followed this exact sequence. My hands knew where to reach before my eyes spotted the next box. The musty air seemed to anticipate my breathing. The woman in the photographs had been the previous tenant, I assumed. She'd lived in the apartment above mine for several years before moving out suddenly. The neighbors mentioned she'd seemed distressed those last few weeks, packing at odd hours, loading her car in the middle of the night. People move for all sorts of reasons. Job transfers, family obligations, financial troubles. Nothing sinister about it. Yet when I held those photographs, my fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold basement air, but from something deeper, a recognition I couldn't name. I remember placing the photos back in the box with unusual care, as if they were evidence rather than memories. The thought struck me as strange even then. Evidence of what? But the word had surfaced unbidden, carrying weight I didn't understand. The curtain fabric kept catching on my ankle as I moved around the room. Each time that same cold whisper against my skin. I should have pushed it aside, but I found myself stepping carefully around it instead, preserving its position, as if it had fallen exactly where it needed to be. In another box I found journals, dozens of them, filled with neat handwriting in blue ink. I opened one to check for contact information, any clue about how to return these personal items. Instead, I found entries describing daily routines, work frustrations, relationship concerns, the mundane thoughts of someone trying to make sense of their life. But scattered throughout were entries that felt different, shorter, more urgent, references to feeling watched, to sounds in the walls, to dreams that felt more real than waking hours. The handwriting in these entries appeared more hurried, letters pressed deeper into the paper. I closed the journal quickly, feeling like an intruder. These were private thoughts, not meant for strangers' eyes, but fragments of those urgent entries clung to my memory. Phrases about shadows moving wrong, about time skipping forward in small jumps, about the certainty that someone else had been in her apartment while she slept. The rational explanation was obvious. The woman had been struggling with anxiety, possibly paranoia. Stress can manifest in countless ways. The mind creates threats when life feels overwhelming. Her sudden departure made perfect sense in that context, seeking help, starting fresh somewhere safer. Still, as I worked in that basement room, I found myself listening more carefully to the sounds above. Footsteps in the apartment that should have been empty, the occasional creak of floorboards settling. Old buildings make noise, I knew that. But some of those footsteps seemed to follow a familiar pattern, the same route I took through my own apartment each morning, kitchen to bathroom to bedroom to front door, as if someone upstairs was mirroring my routine, staying synchronized with my movements. I shook my head, refocusing on the task. Stress can be contagious, especially when you're surrounded by someone else's anxious thoughts preserved in ink. I needed to finish quickly and get back upstairs to fresh air and rational thinking. The next box contained clothing, sweaters, jeans, a few dresses, all in my size. I noticed with surprise, pure coincidence, of course. We were probably similar builds, the previous tenant and I, but holding up a green cardigan, I had the strangest sensation that I'd worn it before. The wool felt familiar against my palms, soft in a way that suggested frequent use. I folded it carefully and placed it back. Someone might want these items. Donation centers always need clothing in good condition. Yet as I handled each piece, that sense of familiarity persisted. A red scarf that seemed to remember the shape of my neck, jeans with wear patterns that matched my walking style, a jacket with a small stain on the left cuff, exactly where I tend to rest my wrist when writing. Coincidences, the mind finds patterns everywhere, even where none exist. I was projecting my own life onto these objects, creating connections that weren't real. But when I found the shoes, my hands began to shake in earnest. They were black leather boots, scuffed in precisely the places mine would be. The left heel worn slightly more than the right, matching my uneven gait. Inside, the leather was shaped by feet that could have been my own, molded by the same pressure points, the same bone structure. I set them down quickly and stepped back. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. That navy curtain seemed to pulse at the edge of my vision as if breathing. I needed to leave. The boxes could wait for another day when I felt more centered. But as I turned toward the stairs, I caught sight of something that stopped me cold. On the concrete wall, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, someone had scratched marks into the surface. Not random scratches, deliberate marks, organized in groups of 5, counting marks, dozens of them, covering several square feet of wall. Counting what, days, weeks, or something else entirely. Below the marks, in that same careful handwriting from the journals, someone had carved a single word into the concrete: remember. My vision blurred, the basement tilted slightly, as if the foundation had shifted beneath my feet. I gripped the nearest box for support, and dust motes swirled in the weak light from the single bulb overhead. Remember what? The question echoed in my mind, but underneath it, something else stirred. Not a thought, but a sensation. The feeling of my own hand gripping a nail, pressing it into concrete, carving that word with desperate precision. My wrist aching from the effort, my knuckles bleeding from scraping against the rough surface. But that was impossible. I'd never been in this basement before today, had I? I stumbled toward the stairs, but the navy curtain caught my ankle again, more insistently this time. As I bent to untangle myself, I noticed something that made my breath catch. The fabric wasn't just any curtain. Along the hem, in tiny stitches, someone had embroidered a pattern of small flowers, the same pattern I'd been working on in my own embroidery project upstairs. The same stitches, the same thread color, the same slightly imperfect technique. I ran my finger along the embroidery, and muscle memory flooded through me. Hours spent hunched over this fabric, needle moving in careful loops, eyes straining in lamplight. The satisfaction of completing each small flower. The way my back had ached from sitting in that uncomfortable chair by the window. But which window? The one in my apartment, or the one in the apartment above? The boxes around me seemed to shift, their contents rearranging themselves into new configurations. Or perhaps my perception was changing, revealing connections that had always been there. I opened another box with trembling hands. Inside, I found a driver's license with my photo, but showing an address I'd never lived at. Credit cards with my name but different account numbers. A lease agreement signed in my handwriting for the apartment upstairs. Documents that proved I was the previous tenant. Documents that proved I'd been living above my own apartment, watching my own routines, following my own patterns. But that couldn't be right. I remembered moving into my apartment, meeting the landlord, signing my own lease. I remembered the previous tenant's sudden departure, the neighbors' whispered concerns. Didn't I? The memories felt solid when I reached for them, but slippery at the edges, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The harder I concentrated, the more they seemed to leak away. I sank to the floor, back against the concrete wall, and closed my eyes. Two versions of reality warred in my mind. In one, I was a helpful tenant cleaning out a stranger's belongings. In the other, I was a woman who had lost time, lost memory, lost pieces of herself that she was now rediscovering in a basement that smelled of cedar and secrets. Both versions felt true, both felt false. Above me, footsteps crossed the ceiling in that familiar pattern. Kitchen to bathroom to bedroom to front door, my pattern. But was it my current self following that routine, or some echo of who I used to be? The counting marks on the wall seemed to multiply in my peripheral vision, spreading across more surface area than before. Had I been counting days of captivity, days of confusion, days of existing in two realities simultaneously? Or was I counting something else entirely, the number of times I'd discovered this basement, these boxes, these impossible truths about myself? The number of times I'd climbed these stairs and forgotten everything, only to return and remember again. The navy curtain stirred in air that shouldn't have been moving. Its embroidered flowers caught the light, and I saw myself stitching them, but I couldn't tell if the memory belonged to yesterday or years ago. I stood slowly, legs unsteady, and looked around the basement one more time. The boxes sat exactly as they had when I'd entered, but now they felt like exhibits in a museum of my own fractured existence. Evidence of a life I'd lived and forgotten, or evidence of delusions I'd constructed to fill gaps in my understanding. The photographs of the smiling woman might have been me, or might have been someone else entirely. The journals might have been my thoughts, or the thoughts of a stranger whose anxieties had infected my own mind. The clothes might have been tailored to my body, or my body might have been shaped by wearing them. I couldn't trust my perceptions anymore, couldn't trust my memories, couldn't trust the very ground beneath my feet. As I climbed the stairs, leaving the basement behind, I carried with me the weight of unanswered questions. The box had snapped shut with that unexpected thud, but what it had contained, truth or fiction, memory or imagination, remained sealed inside, along with all the other secrets I might never fully understand. The dust on my fingertips felt different now, not just ancient, but familiar. Like coming home to a place I'd never been, or returning to a place I'd never really left. Behind me, the basement held its breath, waiting for my next visit, my next discovery, my next attempt to distinguish between the life I thought I was living and the life I might have already lived. The silence wrapped around me, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of possibilities I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. Story 8. It wasn't unusual for the hallway light to flicker. The wiring in the building was old, and power surges happened from time to time. I saw the faint shadows against the walls, dancing erratically as the light struggled to stay on. The door to the storage closet was slightly ajar, just as it had been for weeks. Inside, the papers stacked neatly on shelves felt untouched, and yet I never counted them. Occasionally, I noticed the odd footprint on the cold tile floor, an imprint that seemed too fresh for the dusty corridor. I switched off the light as I left, knowing it would come back on by itself. The coffee grew cold while I stared at the window. Steam had fogged the glass from the inside, and someone had drawn a small circle with their finger, not me. I lived alone, had lived alone for months now. The circle remained there for days, a perfect ring that caught the morning light. I should have wiped it away, but I found myself tracing it instead, my finger following the same path over and over. She used to do that, draw shapes in the condensation, leave little messages that would disappear by afternoon. Hearts, initials, sometimes just random lines that meant nothing to anyone but her. I told myself the circle was coincidence, moisture, and accident, but my hand shook as I traced it. The newspaper clipping fell from between the pages of a book I hadn't opened in years. Local woman missing, the headline read, but the photo was too grainy to make out clearly. I folded it carefully and placed it in my pocket, though I couldn't remember cutting it out. The book was one she'd given me, a collection of poems about loss and remembering. Strange how things surface when you're not looking for them. My neighbor mentioned seeing lights in my apartment when I was away. She was certain, she said, standing in my doorway with her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the room behind me as if searching for evidence. I told her she must have been mistaken, but that night I checked every bulb, every switch, looking for some explanation. Nothing seemed wrong, yet everything felt different. The storage closet called to me in ways I couldn't explain. I found myself standing there in the flickering light, counting papers that never seemed to change in number. 37 manila folders on the top shelf, each one containing documents I'd never bothered to read. Bills, contracts, correspondence from before. Before what, I wasn't always sure, but the word carried weight in my mind. There was blood on my shirt one morning, just a small spot near the collar, rust-colored and dry. I stared at it in the bathroom mirror, trying to remember cutting myself, bumping into something sharp, any reasonable explanation. My reflection looked tired, older somehow, with shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there the night before. I threw the shirt away, but the stain seemed to follow me. The footprints in the hallway multiplied. Not many, just one or two additional marks in the dust, as if someone had walked the same path I walked, stepped where I stepped. The building superintendent claimed he hadn't been up to this floor in weeks, and I believed him. His prints would have been different anyway, heavier, wider. These matched mine almost exactly. She had small feet. I remembered that about her, how she used to complain about finding shoes that fit properly. Size 6, narrow width, with a distinctive wear pattern on the right sole from the way she walked. I kept one of her shoes after she left, told myself it was an accident, that she'd simply forgotten it. Now I couldn't remember where I'd put it. The phone rang at odd hours, but no one spoke when I answered, just breathing, soft and familiar, like someone waiting for me to say the right thing. I started letting it go to the machine, but the caller never left messages. The silence on the other end felt expectant, patient, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. I found her handwriting in the margins of my books, small notes, observations, questions she'd written while reading over my shoulder. The ink looked fresh despite the months that had passed, blue ballpoint that hadn't faded the way old writing should. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the slight indentations in the paper, proof that she had been there, that her hand had pressed these thoughts into existence. The police officer who came to my door was younger than I expected. He asked routine questions about her disappearance, when I'd last seen her, whether we'd argued, if I knew where she might have gone. I answered honestly, I thought, but his eyes kept drifting to the storage closet, as if he could see through the walls to the papers stacked inside. He left his card on my kitchen counter, and I watched from the window as he sat in his car for a long time before driving away. Memory plays tricks when you're alone too much. I started to doubt simple things, like whether I'd locked the door, turned off the stove, fed the cat. I didn't have a cat, hadn't had one in years, but I kept buying cat food anyway. Small cans that accumulated in my pantry, labels facing out in perfect rows. She'd always been better with details, with remembering what needed to be done. The circle on the window changed, subtle alterations as if someone was refining the shape, making it more precise. Sometimes there were 2 circles, overlapping like rings on water. Other times just one, but larger, encompassing more of the glass. I stopped wiping the condensation away entirely, afraid of erasing something important. Her perfume lingered in rooms she'd never entered, faint traces that caught me off guard, made me turn around expecting to see her standing there with that half-smile she wore when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The scent was strongest near the storage closet, though she'd never shown any interest in my filing system, my careful organization of documents and receipts. I began to count everything, Steps from my bed to the bathroom, tiles on the kitchen floor, pages in the book she'd marked with her notes. Numbers became anchors, something solid to hold on to when other certainties slipped away. 37 folders, 14 books with her handwriting, 6 rings of condensation on the window glass, the arithmetic of absence. The newspaper clipping multiplied. I found copies tucked between couch cushions, folded inside coffee filters, pressed between the pages of magazines I didn't remember buying. Each one identical to the first, same grainy photo, same inadequate description. Local woman missing, as if the words could summon her back or explain her departure. Sleep brought dreams of the storage closet, of papers that rearranged themselves in the darkness, forming patterns that almost made sense. I would wake with the taste of dust in my mouth and the certainty that someone had been walking through my apartment while I slept. The floorboards near the closet creaked in a specific sequence, a rhythm I'd learned to recognize. The police officer returned, this time with a partner. They asked to see the storage closet, and I led them down the flickering hallway, my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. They examined the papers, the footprints, the way the door hung slightly open. Their flashlights revealed details I hadn't noticed, dust patterns that suggested recent disturbance, though I couldn't say when or by whom. She used to sleepwalk. I'd forgotten that until the visits from the police reminded me how much I'd tried not to remember. She would rise in the middle of the night and wander through rooms with her eyes closed, touching walls, rearranging objects, sometimes speaking in a voice that didn't sound quite like her own. I would guide her back to bed, and in the morning she'd have no memory of her nocturnal journeys. The truth assembled itself slowly, like photographs developing in a darkroom. Details emerged from shadow, gained definition, revealed connections I'd been too frightened to acknowledge. The storage closet contained more than papers. The footprints were more than coincidence. The circles on the window spelled out messages I'd been too afraid to read. But truth is a luxury I could no longer afford. The police found what they were looking for, and I found what I'd been hiding from myself. In the end, the flickering light illuminated everything and nothing, casting shadows that danced like memories on walls that had heard too many secrets. The hallway light still flickers, and I still notice the footprints in the dust, though now I know whose they are. Story 9. The switch refused to click. My fingers nudged it again, expecting the familiar snap, but the room stayed in shadow. The carpet underfoot felt somehow too smooth, too unyielding, as if it had forgotten my tread. I walked past the hallway mirror, its surface dull, my reflection vague, almost unwilling to follow. The kitchen door swung open easily, too easily, though I was the only one home. I hesitated, reaching for the chair that seemed to lean away, its legs giving no drag across the floor. All around, objects held their breath, watching with eyes that weren't there. I tell myself it started with a power outage. That's the logical explanation, the one that makes sense when I speak to others about it. The storm had been building for hours, and the electrical grid in our neighborhood had always been unreliable. When I came home that evening, the house felt different because it was dark, because the familiar hum of appliances had fallen silent. The air conditioning wasn't running, so the atmosphere felt thick and stagnant. That's why my skin prickled as I moved through the rooms. I remember checking each room methodically, the way anyone would when returning to a house without power. I used the flashlight from my phone to navigate, the blue-white beam cutting through the darkness and casting strange shadows on the walls. Everything appeared normal. The living room furniture sat in its usual arrangement. The books on the shelves stood in neat rows. The kitchen counters were clean, just as I had left them that morning. But even as I construct this narrative, something underneath it squirms and resists. The memory of that evening carries a weight that doesn't match the simple explanation of a power failure. When I think about the mirror in the hallway, I remember pausing there longer than necessary, studying my reflection in the dim light from my phone. My face looked hollow, unfamiliar, as if I were seeing a stranger who happened to share my features. The chair in the kitchen bothers me most. I can picture myself reaching for it, intending to sit down while I waited for the power to return. But when my fingers touched the wooden back, it felt warm. Not room temperature warm, but body warm, as if someone had just been sitting there. I jerked my hand away and stepped back, my heart suddenly racing. That's when the alternative version begins to surface, like something rising from deep water. In this other telling, I wasn't alone in the house. I had never been alone. Someone else had been there when I arrived, someone who knew how to move through the rooms without disturbing anything, how to sit in chairs without leaving impressions, how to breathe without making sound. This presence had been watching me from the beginning, tracking my movements as I went from room to room with my inadequate phone light. The power hadn't gone out. The switches worked perfectly. I simply couldn't bring myself to turn them on because some part of me understood that light would reveal what I wasn't ready to see. My fingers had found the switch easily enough, but they refused to complete the motion, held back by an instinct older than reason. I shake my head, trying to dispel these thoughts. They feel like contamination, like a virus spreading through my memory and changing everything it touches. The rational explanation remains solid. I can call the power company and verify that there was indeed an outage in my area that evening. I can point to the storm clouds that had been gathering all afternoon. I can explain the strange sensations as products of anxiety and darkness, the natural result of being in an unfamiliar environment. But my body remembers differently. My skin recalls the feeling of being observed, the weight of attention from unseen eyes. My ears hold the echo of breathing that wasn't mine, soft and measured, coming from somewhere behind me as I moved through the house. When I turned to locate the source, there was nothing there, just empty space and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The kitchen chair remains a focal point for both versions of the story. In the logical telling, it was simply retaining heat from the day's warmth, perhaps positioned where afternoon sunlight had been streaming through the window. But in the other version, the warmth was recent and human, evidence of an occupant who had vacated the seat only moments before my arrival. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway, paralyzed by uncertainty. The rational part of my mind insisted that I should sit down, that I should wait calmly for the power to return, but my instincts screamed warnings I couldn't interpret. The air in the room felt dense with presence, thick with the residue of someone else's existence. That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle, almost subliminal, but distinctly human. Not unpleasant, just foreign. The scent of someone else's skin, their breath, their clothes. It hung in the air like invisible smoke, proof of occupation that my eyes couldn't detect. Or maybe it was just the stuffiness that accumulates in a house without air circulation. Maybe my imagination was filling in details that weren't there, creating a narrative to explain my discomfort. The mind does that, doesn't it? It constructs stories to make sense of ambiguous sensations, to transform uncertainty into something manageable. But then I remember the footsteps. They came from upstairs, soft but unmistakable. The creak of floorboards under weight, the whisper of feet moving across carpet. I froze in the kitchen, my phone light trembling in my hand, listening to the slow, deliberate progress of someone walking through the rooms above my head. In the rational version, these were settling noises. Old houses make sounds as they adjust to temperature changes. The absence of the air conditioning system had allowed the structure to shift in ways that were normally masked by mechanical noise. The creaking was just wood expanding and contracting, nothing more. But I counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. A pause. Then the sound of a door opening, hinges sighing softly. Another pause. The footsteps resumed, moving in a different direction now, toward the staircase. I should have called out. If someone was in my house, I should have demanded to know who they were, what they wanted. Instead, I found myself backing toward the kitchen door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The footsteps continued their descent, measured and unhurried, as if their owner had all the time in the world. That's when the two versions of events begin to merge and separate simultaneously, like streams of water that touch and divide. In one reality, I waited in the kitchen until the power returned, flooding the house with normal light and revealing nothing more threatening than familiar furniture and empty rooms. The footsteps had been imaginary, products of stress and darkness. In the other reality, I never turned on any lights. I crept through my own house like an intruder, avoiding the places where I sensed another presence, navigating by touch and instinct through rooms that had become foreign territory. The footsteps belonged to someone who knew the house as well as I did, someone who moved through it with casual familiarity. My memory splits here, offering me two incompatible truths. I can recall both the relief of electric light returning and the continued darkness that stretched through the entire night. I can remember both the emptiness of confirmed solitude and the persistent awareness of shared space. The mirror in the hallway becomes a pivot point between these realities. When I finally approached it again, preparing to leave the kitchen, my reflection looked different than it had before. In the logical version, this was simply the effect of changing light conditions, the way shadows and illumination can alter appearance. But in the other telling, my reflection showed signs of time I couldn't account for. My hair was disheveled in ways that didn't match my movements. My clothes were wrinkled as if I had been sitting or lying down, though I remembered only standing and walking. Most disturbing of all, my expression in the mirror was one of recognition, as if I were looking at someone I knew but hadn't expected to see. My reflected eyes held knowledge that my conscious mind couldn't access, secrets that my face was keeping from me. I reached out to touch the glass, and my reflection did the same, but there was a delay, just a fraction of a second, as if the person in the mirror was copying my movements rather than mirroring them. I pulled my hand back quickly, and again there was that tiny hesitation before my reflection followed suit. Standing there in front of the mirror, I felt the two versions of events pressing against each other like opposing forces. The rational explanation demanded acceptance, insisted on its own coherence and logic, but the alternative truth pushed back with equal strength, supported by physical sensations and emotional certainties that couldn't be dismissed. I left the house that night, though I can't remember making the decision to go. In one version, I walked out into the normal evening air, got into my car, and drove to a nearby coffee shop to wait until I felt ready to return home. The power outage had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, and I needed the comfort of bright lights and other people. In the other version, I fled. I ran from something I couldn't name, something that had been sharing my space and breathing my air. I drove aimlessly through empty streets, windows down, trying to clear my lungs of that foreign scent, that evidence of unwanted presence. When I finally returned, the house felt different again, clean somehow, emptied, as if whatever had been there had departed, leaving behind only the faintest traces of occupancy. I moved through the rooms with my phone light, checking corners and closets, looking for signs of disturbance. Everything appeared untouched. But the chair in the kitchen was positioned differently. I was certain of it. The angle was wrong, turned slightly away from the table in a way that suggested recent use. When I touched the seat, it was cool now, normal, but the wooden back still held that phantom warmth that made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, listening to the house settle around me. Every sound made me tense, every shadow seemed to move with purpose. By morning, exhaustion had dulled my senses enough that I could almost convince myself the entire episode had been a product of stress and imagination. But the doubt remains, lodged in my mind like a splinter. Sometimes I catch myself checking the kitchen chair when I come home, looking for signs of warmth or displacement. I avoid the hallway mirror in certain light conditions, unwilling to risk seeing that delayed reflection again. And I never ever trust a light switch that doesn't click properly on the first try. The truth is probably simple. Houses make noises. Darkness plays tricks on perception. Stress and isolation can create experiences that feel completely real but have no basis in objective reality. I tell myself these things, and most of the time I believe them. But late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm balanced on the edge of sleep, I sometimes catch that scent again. Subtle, human, foreign, and I lie there in the darkness, wondering if I'm alone, wondering if I've ever really been alone, wondering if the person I saw in the mirror that night was actually me at all. Story 10. My position at the window was one of vigilant rest, a perfect vantage from which to detect the slightest anomaly. Yet the street below was a silent tableau, each car an unmoving silhouette, each distant tree a frozen sentry. The air, however, felt alive, dense with an anticipation that had no source, as if a pulse beat beneath the surface, shifting ever so slightly, but never revealing itself. Then without warning, a street lamp faltered, casting an odd, skewed light across the pavement, a slant that hadn't been there before. I knew what I was looking for. The pattern had become clear over weeks of careful observation, and tonight would be no different. The figure would emerge from the house across the street at the same interval, carrying that distinctive leather satchel, moving with the same measured pace toward the corner where the old mailbox stood crooked against the sidewalk. 3 houses down, the porch light would flicker twice, always twice, as if responding to some invisible signal. This wasn't paranoia, this was documentation. I had filled 2 notebooks with timestamps, weather conditions, and behavioral notes. The routine never varied by more than a few minutes. The figure always paused at the mailbox, always glanced back toward my building, always continued south until the darkness swallowed the silhouette whole. I understood the significance of what I was witnessing. Someone was using my neighborhood as a drop point, a way station in something much larger than the quiet residential street suggested. The leather satchel never returned the same way it left. The figure's clothing changed subtly, but consistently darker colors on certain nights, lighter fabrics when the moon was full. These weren't coincidences. The street lamp's faltering light created shadows that seemed to breathe. I adjusted my position in the chair, the one I'd positioned specifically for these vigils, and checked my watch, right on schedule. The front door across the street should open within the next 2 minutes. But tonight felt different. The air carried a thickness that hadn't been present during previous observations. The usual sounds, distant traffic, the hum of air conditioning units, the occasional dog bark seemed muffled, as if the world had wrapped itself in cotton. Even the street lamp's irregular flickering felt deliberate, timed to some rhythm I couldn't quite identify. My certainty began to waver when the door remained closed past the usual time. 5 minutes late, then 10. The figure had never been this delayed before. I rechecked my notes, flipping through pages of meticulous records, but the pattern had been consistent for weeks. Something had changed. When the door finally opened, the figure that emerged wasn't quite right. The same height, the same general build, but the movement was different, more hesitant. The leather satchel was there, but it hung differently from the shoulder, as if heavier than usual, or lighter, I couldn't tell which. The pause at the mailbox lasted longer tonight. Instead of the usual glance back toward my building, the figure turned fully, facing my window directly. I pulled back instinctively, though I knew the room behind me was dark, my position hidden. But something in that prolonged stare suggested awareness, recognition even. That's when the first crack appeared in my understanding. As I watched the figure continue down the street, I realized I couldn't recall exactly when I'd first noticed the pattern. The memory felt solid weeks of observation, careful documentation, but when I tried to pin down the specific night it had all started, the details became fuzzy. I opened my first notebook, the one I was certain contained the earliest entries. The handwriting was mine, the timestamps precise, but something about the ink looked odd under my desk lamp. Some entries appeared darker than others, as if written with different pens or at different times than I remembered. The paper felt wrong too, softer than it should be for notes that were supposedly weeks old. My hands were trembling slightly as I turned the pages. The observations were all there, exactly as I remembered recording them, but gaps appeared that I hadn't noticed before, missing dates, skipped entries. On one page, an entire week seemed to have vanished, leaving only a faint impression where writing might have been erased. The smell hit me, then something I should have recognized immediately but had somehow overlooked. The notebooks carried the scent of the basement, musty and damp, as if they'd been stored somewhere dark for much longer than a few weeks. But I kept them here, in this room, in the drawer beside my observation chair. I returned to the window, but the street had transformed. The shadows cast by the flickering street lamp fell differently now, creating shapes that seemed to shift independently of their sources. The parked cars, which I'd catalogued meticulously in my notes, weren't in the same positions. The sedan that had occupied the space directly across from my building was gone, replaced by a truck that looked like it had been there for months, covered in a layer of dust and fallen leaves. The house where the figure emerged, I stared at it now with growing unease. The porch light was burned out, had been for what looked like a considerable time, judging by the spider webs across the fixture. The mailbox I'd watched the figure pause at every night was missing entirely, leaving only a concrete base and some rusty bolts. But I had watched this routine for weeks. I had documented every detail. The evidence was right here in my notebooks, written in my own hand. Yet the physical world outside my window told a different story, one that made my careful observations seem like elaborate fiction. I began to understand that my certainty had been built on something unstable. The pattern I'd identified, the routine I'd documented so meticulously, existed primarily in these notebooks. But notebooks could be written anytime by anyone. Handwriting could be practiced, perfected, made to look natural and spontaneous when it was anything but. The basement smell grew stronger. I followed it to the drawer where I kept my observation materials, and when I pulled it open completely, I found things I didn't remember placing there. Photographs of the street taken from this same window, but showing different seasons, different light. Some were clearly older than my supposed weeks of surveillance, their edges yellowed and corners bent. In one photograph, I could see my own reflection in the window glass, but I was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, and my hair was different, shorter. The reflection looked younger, or maybe older, it was hard to tell in the dim lighting, but definitely not how I looked now. Another photograph showed the street during what appeared to be a storm. Rain streaked the window, and through the distortion, a figure stood under the street lamp, not walking, not pausing at any mailbox, but simply standing there, looking up toward my window. The figure's face was obscured by the rain and distance, but something about the posture suggested familiarity. The leather satchel lay on the ground beside the figure's feet. I realized I had been assuming the figure was a stranger, someone whose activities I was observing from a distance. But what if the surveillance had been mutual? What if the pattern I'd documented was as much about my behavior as theirs? Looking back through the notebooks with this new perspective, the entries began to read differently. The timestamps corresponded not just to when the figure appeared, but to when I positioned myself at the window. The weather notations matched not just the conditions outside, but my own moods and physical state. On nights when I'd noted the figure moved more slowly, I'd also recorded feeling tired or unwell. The pattern wasn't something I'd discovered. It was something I'd created or participated in without fully understanding my role. The street lamp flickered again, and in its unstable light I saw movement across the street. Not the emergence of a figure from the house, but someone approaching from the direction where my observations always ended, walking back toward the missing mailbox, carrying something that might have been a leather satchel, or might have been something else entirely. As the figure drew closer, passing under the lamp's erratic illumination, I caught a glimpse of features that seemed familiar. The height was right, the build matched my own, but the face remained indistinct, shadowed by the angle of the light and the distance between us. The figure paused where the mailbox used to be, then turned to look directly up at my window. This time I didn't pull back. I remained visible, framed in the dim glow of my desk lamp, and we regarded each other across the empty street. I understood then that my weeks of careful observation had been leading to this moment, this recognition. But I couldn't tell who was watching whom, who was the subject and who was the observer. The notebooks in my lap felt heavier now, filled with documentation of something that might have been surveillance or might have been something else entirely. The figure raised one hand in what could have been a greeting or a warning or simply an acknowledgement of our mutual awareness. Then they turned and walked away, not toward the corner where my observations always ended, but back toward the house across the street, the one with the burned-out porch light and the missing mailbox. I watched until they disappeared into the shadows between street lamps, then looked down at my notebooks one more time. The entries were all still there, written in my careful handwriting, documenting weeks of observation. But now I wondered if they were records of what I'd seen or instructions for what I was supposed to do. The air in the room had grown thick again, dense with that same anticipation I'd felt at the beginning of the night. But now I recognized the sensation. It wasn't the anticipation of discovery, of finally understanding the pattern I'd been documenting. It was the anticipation of return, of going back to the window tomorrow night and the night after to continue observations that might be surveillance or might be something else entirely. The leather satchel, the measured pace, the glance back toward my building, all of it would continue because the pattern demanded completion. And I still wasn't certain which side of the window I was really on.